Imagine waking up tomorrow and being told that you probably won't live past 35. No guarantees. No safety net. No doctor you can call. Just you, a world full of invisible killers, and absolutely no idea why people around you keep dying. That was the reality for millions of ordinary people living through the Middle Ages. We look back at this period and see towering castles, epic battles, and romantic folklore. But strip away the romanticized version of history and what you're left with is one of the most brutal, unforgiving, and frankly terrifying environments a human being could ever be born into. A world where getting a small cut on your hand could kill you. Where giving birth was a gamble with death. Where an entire village could be wiped out before anyone even understood what was happening. So what exactly was cutting lives so devastatingly short? What were the real reasons ancient humans in the Middle Ages died so young? And if you had been born into that world, what would your honest chances of survival actually look like? That's exactly what we're going to break down today. Let's start with the hard truth sitting right at the center of this topic. Historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that the average life expectancy during the Middle Ages sat somewhere between 30 and 40 years of age. 30 to 40 years. By today's standards, that's barely past young adulthood. That's a world where reaching your 50th birthday would make you something of a local legend. But here's where things get more complicated and more interesting. That number is actually misleading, and understanding why it's misleading tells you almost everything you need to know about why people died so young in this period. The life expectancy figure was dragged down enormously by one single, devastating factor: the death of children. Infant mortality during the Middle Ages was catastrophic. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of children born during this period never made it to their 5th birthday. When you factor those numbers into an average, the result looks like everyone died young. But the reality was more nuanced. If a person managed to survive childhood, if they made it through the gauntlet of infancy and early youth, they actually stood a reasonable chance of reaching their 50s, 60s, or even beyond. So the more precise and more disturbing question isn't simply why people died young. It's why so many people, at so many different stages of life, were dying at all. And the answers to that question fall into several devastating categories. Perhaps the single greatest killer operating throughout the Middle Ages wasn't a weapon, a war, or even a specific disease. It was ignorance. The concept of germ theory, the understanding that microscopic organisms cause infection and illness, wasn't established until the 19th century. That means for the entire duration of the Middle Ages, spanning roughly the 5th to the 15th century, nobody had any idea what was actually making people sick. Not the physicians. Not the scholars. Not the kings. Disease was attributed to bad air, divine punishment, astrological alignments, or simple bad luck. The result was that the actual causes of illness went completely unaddressed, and the cures being applied ranged from useless to actively deadly. Into this environment of total medical blindness stepped a terrifying parade of diseases. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, measles, influenza, malaria, leprosy, these were not rare or exotic conditions. They were the background noise of everyday medieval life. And without antibiotics, without vaccines, without even a basic understanding of sanitation, each one of them carried a genuine and serious risk of death. A person with a badly infected wound today takes a course of antibiotics and recovers in a week. In the Middle Ages, that same infection could spread through the bloodstream and kill within days. Septicemia, blood poisoning, was a quiet but relentless executioner, cutting down soldiers, farmers, and noble women alike with brutal efficiency and zero discrimination. No honest conversation about death in the Middle Ages can avoid the event that stands above everything else in terms of sheer, incomprehensible scale. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and what followed was arguably the most catastrophic single event in recorded human history. Driven by bubonic and pneumonic plague, the disease tore through populations that had no immunity, no treatment, and no understanding of how it spread. Between 1347 and 1352, estimates suggest that between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East lost their lives. In Europe specifically, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population was wiped out within a matter of years. Let those numbers settle for a moment. In some cities, the death toll was so overwhelming that the living could not keep pace with burying the dead. Bodies piled in streets. Entire villages were abandoned. Families were destroyed within days of each other. The social, economic, and psychological damage inflicted on the surviving population reverberated for generations. And the cruelest part? Nobody knew why it was happening. Physicians bled their patients. Priests prayed. People fled their homes, unknowingly carrying the disease with them into new towns and new regions. Every response to the plague, driven by ignorance of its true cause, either did nothing or actively made things worse. If you had been an ordinary person living in Europe during those 5 years, your chances of surviving would have been roughly the same as a coin flip. And you would have watched almost everyone you knew die around you with no explanation and no end in sight. Surviving the Black Death was, of course, a matter of being alive in the first place. And simply arriving in the world during the Middle Ages was its own extraordinary risk. Childbirth during this period killed women at alarming rates. Without any understanding of infection, without sterile instruments or conditions, and without any meaningful pain management, labor and delivery was genuinely life-threatening for both mother and child. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection occurring after childbirth, alone claimed an enormous number of lives, and it was almost entirely preventable with basic hygiene that simply wasn't understood at the time. This wasn't a problem exclusive to the poor. Queens, noblewomen, and the wives of wealthy merchants died in childbirth at rates that remind us, bluntly, that money could buy many things in the Middle Ages, but it could not buy the knowledge that would have saved these women's lives. For children who did survive birth, the dangers were far from over. The first 5 years of life represented the most dangerous window of the entire medieval lifespan. Diseases that modern vaccines eliminate entirely, measles, smallpox, whooping cough, were childhood killers operating at industrial scale throughout this period. If disease in childbirth were the problem, surely the medicine of the time offered some relief? Unfortunately, medieval medicine was in many cases not just ineffective but actively harmful. The dominant medical philosophy of the period was rooted in the concept of the four humors, the idea that health depended on maintaining a balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment, therefore, focused on restoring that balance rather than addressing any actual underlying cause of illness. In practice, this meant that a sick person might be subjected to bloodletting, the deliberate cutting of veins or application of leeches to drain blood from the body. A patient already weakened by infection or fever would then be further weakened by having significant quantities of blood removed. People died not just from their illnesses but from their treatments. Surgical procedures, when they were attempted, were carried out without anesthetic and without sterile conditions. Amputations, sometimes necessary to stop the spread of gangrene, were performed with instruments that had likely been used on previous patients without any cleaning. The screaming patient might be given alcohol beforehand, or simply struck unconscious. Survival of the surgery itself was only the first challenge. Survival of the infection that almost inevitably followed was an entirely separate battle that many patients lost. Underlying all of these causes of death was a more fundamental and relentless problem: hunger. Medieval agriculture was entirely at the mercy of weather, seasons, and the absence of any modern understanding of soil management or crop science. A late frost, a summer drought, a flood, or a pest infestation could destroy an entire season's harvest. And in a world where the vast majority of the population were peasant farmers living at subsistence level, a destroyed harvest didn't mean hardship. It meant starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is one of the most catastrophic examples. Triggered by years of extraordinarily cold and wet weather that devastated crops across Europe, the famine killed millions. In some regions, up to 25% of the population died. And a population weakened by malnutrition is a population dramatically more vulnerable to every other killer on this list. Disease spreads faster, wounds heal slower, and bodies worn down by hunger simply give out sooner. Malnutrition wasn't only a famine-time problem. For enormous numbers of medieval people, getting enough food, and the right kinds of food, was a constant, year-round struggle that quietly weakened immune systems, stunted physical development, and shortened lives without ever announcing itself as a cause of death. Strip it all back and the reason ancient humans died so young in the Middle Ages comes down to a single, unifying thread: they were living in a world of profound dangers that they fundamentally did not understand and therefore could not effectively fight. They didn't understand germs, so infection ran unchecked. They didn't understand nutrition, so malnutrition weakened entire populations. They didn't understand disease transmission, so plagues spread with nothing to slow them. They didn't understand basic surgical hygiene, so the people trying to save lives were sometimes ending them faster. The Middle Ages were not an era of stupid people. They were an era of intelligent, resilient, deeply human people operating without the accumulated scientific knowledge that we now take entirely for granted. The real miracle of this period isn't how many people died young. It's that enough survived to carry humanity forward to the world we live in today. So what do you think? If you had been born into the Middle Ages, where would you have placed your bets on survival? And which period of history do you think was even more brutal to live through? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this video fascinating, make sure you check out our other video on how ancient humans migrated across the globe. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.